Hi, this is Mike Tierney of Data Not Distress, and I wanted to tell a bit of a personal story about COVID-18, which was the same thing as COVID-19 except the year before, except it turned out that I was the only person just about who noticed that it was as bad as what the next year's was supposed to be, and it teaches a lesson, I think, about the nature of airborne disease, cold and flu, and why certain people get it worse than others. It has everything to do with what you do with it, and it's subtleties that you need to keep in mind. And I think once you do, it will help you and all of us to keep airborne disease from becoming worse than it needs to be. So I got COVID-18 in January 2019, and I got it from my dad, who was traveling. And for my dad, you buy these tickets ahead of time. Oh, I have this little cold. So he sounded horrible. He was congested, trouble breathing, but he was okay, and we could go out and do things. And he was traveling, so he was out doing things, and thus everything that his body was producing, virion particles infect, one virion particle infects one cell, and for coronavirus makes 100 copies of itself. All of those are, the reason it's called airborne disease, all of those are made to expel and be breathed out into the air. And so by being out and around and doing things outdoors, those particles end up being breathed out into the open air, and out into the sun, where they'll just be fried like an egg. Viruses don't have fur coats. If this little virion particle gets out into the sunlight, especially out here in California, the sun is brutal and gone. It'll be finished. So that's why living normal lives is such an important part of having a normal cold season, and having cold and flu be as minimally virulent and therefore deadly as possible. But when my dad was here, it was 50 degrees, and so it was comfortable. Right? The day after he left, it went down to 30 degrees during the day here in Oakland, California. And for those of you who live elsewhere, that's like -40, essentially, right? We don't have this thing called insulation. We don't do cold temperatures. And so when it was 30 during the day, gee, guess what? Guess what I did? I was locked down, and I was sheltered in place, and I had the windows all closed, and because it was too cold to go out. And so what I was doing was indoors, breathing out everything that my body had been exposed to and everything that it was producing. It was forming this cloud right around me, and I was breathing it right back in. And so I got inundated. It was 3 days of that. And it was 30 degrees, 30 degrees, 30 degrees. So I had all the windows shut, and there I was, just breathing back in everything that I was exposed to. Unlike my dad, who was out doing things, and so for him it was just an annoying, oh, that cold, that runny nose. Right? Well, the same virus for me, because I inundated myself with it, ended up being 8 to 9 days in bed, debilitating. Just, I didn't have the energy to do anything. I had trouble breathing. I had all of these supposedly unique symptoms. Oh my God, we've just never seen this before in COVID-19. Well, I saw most of them in COVID-18. I don't think I had the can't taste, can't smell thing in that one. But I think I had that probably in 1 out of every 5 colds and flus I've ever had. The coronavirus is 20% of all common colds. Maybe it was more like 1 in every 6, including influenza. But it was absolutely debilitating. I had to get up, like, and for things that I needed to do, I would get up, do a little bit of that one thing, and then get back in bed, and then build up the energy to get back up out of bed and do a little bit more of that thing, and then get back in bed, and like I say, I had trouble breathing. But what I did was I did not go to a doctor or a hospital to kill cancer patients and produce a body count. What I did was drink fluids and get in bed and get rest. And when I had trouble breathing and I did that, I would wake up and I'd feel a little bit better, and then I'd stay up and I'd feel worse again, and I'd drink more fluids and I'd get back in bed. And that's how you handle cold and flu. Even when you did the wrong thing for airborne disease, I did the right thing for the freezing temperatures, but it didn't really occur to me because I airborne disease isn't a big priority for me in any way, shape, or form. I don't care one way or another. Covid-19, Covid-18, cold and flu is and always will be the same thing. Always the same thing. Even in 1918, there was no magic flu virus. It was the same flu virus that it's always been. China had an ordinary flu season that same year with the same virus that their trading partners in India, that they were in contact with constantly, trading goods. And India, who was controlled by Britain at the time, had trouble with the flu that year. Well, the thing is, when you said influenza back in 1918, what you were talking about was bacteria, Bacillus influenzae, and that's the reason they called it the influenza pandemic even from that time. They didn't know about the virus. The virus was discovered about a decade later. But they had everything that they needed to know exactly what people were dying of in 1918. I have a FAQ on the Data Not Distress site about the 1918 flu, but there's a study that's been done that went back through the medical records. You can tell whether someone's had a viral or a bacterial infection based on temperature and other aspects of their illness, and it's right there in the medical records. So when they went and looked, they found that, gee, lo and behold, the people, by and large, who died in 1918 died of a bacterial infection, Bacillus influenzae. And Bacillus influenzae is the real deal. It will kill an elephant. It will eat your lungs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and when it's done, so are you. It's over. It is the real deal. But you don't get Bacillus influenzae by going to the theater. You don't get Bacillus influenzae by walking down the street. You get Bacillus influenzae when you've been put into a big tent filled with beds, with people next to you who have that deadly bacteria, and they cough it all up all over the new patients who get the bacteria then that then kills them. And that's why the 1918 pandemic lasted 8 months. 8 months. And the most deadly wave of it killed young people. Very unusual for cold and flu. Well, gee, why is that? It's because the gullible people, the people who would go to hospitals and doctors with an airborne disease, are the people who were killed. It was like an assembly line of death. These people would get the flu virus, and you get the runny nose and all that. You get the symptoms of a bacterial infection, and because of the terror campaign, were terrorized into going to the hospital, where they were then put into these warehouses of beds next to patients who had the deadly bacteria, and there they were then all day long getting coughed all over with this deadly bacteria that eventually they breathed in, and enough breathing it in, lying there in a weakened state with the flu virus, the bacteria could then take hold, and one after the other, they killed all of these people, and it's, if you look at the numbers, 1.5 million. I mean, it's just like a crazy number compared to every other cold and flu pandemic. But looking at the reality of that, you know, in 1918, it was people that killed people with you know, this airborne disease. It was medical malpractice, and the COVID-19 pandemic, same thing. It was medical malpractice, letting these people with a virus overwhelm the hospital that was loaded up with the largest elderly population in human history, with cancer, heart disease, stroke, COPD, all of these diseases that you need to be, you need a sterile environment if you're going to survive your hospital treatment. Let's face it, our hospital treatments are brutal. And if you don't have every advantage, and one of those major advantages is a sterile environment, you're not going to survive it. And that's what we did. We overwhelmed our hospital with people with a communicable disease and ended up killing all our hospital patients. There was an article somewhere in the middle there in 2020 with a doctor saying, gee, where did all our cancer patients go? We only have these COVID patients now. Yeah, where did those cancer patients go, huh? Wow, what a surprise. So, like I say, it's medical malpractice, really, that killed people in the COVID-19 pandemic. But if you look back through all of them, we've had these terror campaigns, Hong Kong flu, Asian flu, that ended up pushing more people than usual with a communicable disease into the hospital. And it's that dynamic that ends up killing more people with cold and flu. Again, in 1918, my grandparents lived through it. They were preteens during that pandemic. So they saw everything that happened. And their wisdom coming out of that, what they always told me, is that doctors are quacks. They have no idea what they're doing. And that's why you need to stay away from them. The thing is, their generation, I think, learned that lesson for themselves, but didn't do as well in teaching it to the younger generation and really ingraining that reality. I mean, the thing is, we have this cartoon Dilbert. Never mind what's happened to it recently, but it's traditionally been something that everyone could relate to in the dysfunction in our workplaces. Well, guess what a hospital is? Guess what our medical industry is? It's just another one of those. It's just another place where Dilbert is exhibited, where dysfunction and malpractice occur, and I mean, and particularly with the medical industry, because their industry is meddling with people's lives. And of course, you know, mistakes and just doing everything wrong as we did in this pandemic are always a risk. So, as I say, for me, COVID-18 was the same thing as COVID-19. And because it is, always, it was the same thing as COVID-17, the same thing as COVID-16. Like I say, all of the symptoms, including long COVID. Well, gee, at the beginning of this pandemic, I had a friend telling me about how his girlfriend had symptoms and effects a decade later after being sick with the flu. And I don't know the details of that, but I'm telling you that she probably ended up like closing her bedroom door and closing the windows and staying in bed and breathing back in this thing for you know, as long as it took. And that's one thing very interesting. Also, in 1918, there was a poster that really kind of shows that in many ways they understood more about airborne disease back then than we understand today. And that poster said, to avoid this 1918 pandemic illness, sleep with your bedroom window open. And that was incredibly insightful. I didn't hear anyone saying anything about that sort of thing in this COVID-19 pandemic, and that's what I mean when we're so impressed with our understanding of the minutia of things, medical and things, all things science today, that we lose sight of the reality that we get lost in the minutia, and we fail to look at the overall. And in this case, just observing how this thing behaves. What is it in itself? If you leave the window open when you go to sleep, we notice that you don't get it as badly. Well, think about what I've said with this, this cloud that you're creating around yourself, where you're breathing back in the same thing your body's producing, and you get inundated, you get overwhelmed. By leaving that bedroom window open, what you're doing is letting that cloud out. You're airing it out. You're getting it away from yourself, so you're not breathing it back in. They understood that back in 1918. Just by observing, right? A better understanding of how to protect ourselves from airborne disease back then than we have today. With all our, we just understand so much, we're so smart. Well, our so smart science ended up killing 10 times the number of people that needed to. And 10 times the number of people that did in countries that did the right thing in keeping people away from hospitals and doctors. So, the lessons, so many. So in closing, there's a lot of tangents to this, and I could go on forever, which is part of the problem. It's very difficult to get a focused take on things, which is why I usually write up a script. This one I completely just talked about this off the top of my head, and I'll go off on the tangents because there's so many, and I need to compartmentalize these, and I'll maybe do little mini videos with all the different tangents covered individually, but the bottom line is, as I say, that COVID-18 was the same as COVID-19, was the same as COVID-17, was the same as COVID-16. Cold and flu always have been and always will be the same thing, always. There will never be a more deadly cold or flu, ever. And it's simple biology that explains that. And that's all you need to know. I mean, please study biology and study in particular evolution, and think about what that means. We are in an ecosystem of unbelievable complexity. I am a strong believer that the only technology that's ever been developed on this planet is animal life, period. There is nothing else. Nothing else that is even close to rivaling the complexity and the elegance of animal life. It is stunning. But I say animal life, and it's we eat plants, and we work with and are infected by viruses, bacteria, all of these other organisms, fungus, can't forget fungus. They're all part of us. They're all part of, and we're part of an ecosystem. They are our partners, all of them. But viruses in particular have made us what we are, have made us the strong and resilient animals that we are. We owe all of that to them. And to not have respect for them, and to not accept them as a part of us, because they absolutely are. Into every life, cold and flu will come, and that's okay. That's okay. And the thing is, as another tangent I could go off on is, Cold and flu is the only humane way of dying of natural causes. Period. It is a short disease progression where you are guaranteed to die peacefully in your sleep. And think about, look at the top 10 causes of death. And think about what it is, 100% chance of dying. Think about what it is you want to experience on the way out. Think about what it is that you want your final experiences to be. Do you really want a slow, long, agonizing death where you feel every last pain of death on the way out? Or do you want a short disease progression where you're guaranteed to die peacefully in your sleep? I think if you look at that realistically, COVID-19 is not only nothing to fear, but it's everything to welcome. It's God's gift. It's the one way that we have of dying where you're not going to feel the last pains of death. You're going to die in your sleep. And ask the gambler, Kenny Rogers, right? The best that you can hope for is to die in your sleep. And that's absolutely true. Because every other way of going, of natural causes, is a horribly brutal and painful and agonizing way to go. So, in closing, as if there could be, cold and flu will always be the same thing. It's nothing to fear. It's nothing to try to avoid. And honestly, the people trying to get you to avoid cold and flu are doing just about the worst thing for humanity that they ever could. They're the worst people imaginable. Because, as I say, cold and flu is God's gift. To avoid it is to spit in the face of God. And that doesn't end well. So we need to come to terms with the reality of our role in this ecosystem of Earth, and that we're just a part of it, and accept the realities of what we face. And part of that is accepting cold and flu is always there, always will be the same thing. There's no escaping it. There's no vaccine that works. You can't vaccinate against cold and flu. Another tangent I could go off on is Jonas Salk and how he outclassed our entire pharmaceutical industry in the 1940s. As an intern, wet behind the ears out of college, and made a flu vaccine, and he saw it firsthand. You know, the days after he created the thing, wow, it's working. Oh my gosh, look at this. Then the next week, it wasn't doing as much good. The week after that, even less. The week after that, even less. A month later, it wasn't doing anything. And that's the reality of any cold or flu vaccine. By the time that you could roll the thing out, it's already ineffective. It already doesn't do anything. That is why Jonas Salk did not ever look back at flu vaccines. It did not ever look back at airborne disease vaccines. Because he saw firsthand, his first job out of college, that it doesn't work. It's a failed strategy. It just is not possible to do. That's why he went and moved on to diseases that have specific weaknesses to target. Measles. There's one mechanism that measles uses to infect our cells. And if you get in the way of that one mechanism, you stop the entire virus from having any effect on us. And that's what the measles vaccine is. And across the line, polio, tetanus, all of these have weaknesses that you target with the vaccine. You're not just trying to chase airborne disease around in circles, which is the only thing that you'll ever do with a cold or flu vaccine. It's why 20% effective, the flu vaccine 30% effective on average. That's not effective. right? Measles, over 90%. And any real vaccine is over 90% effective decades later. If your grandparents could have gotten that same disease, and that vaccine still works today, 90% effective, that's a vaccine. And it's gotten decades of testing, which is absolutely essential. Because like I say, another tangent, 5 years of a thalidomide prescriptions, handed out like candy, handed out to pregnant women. And it took them 5 years to figure out that they needed to get this thing off the market. The question I have is how long did they know? How long did they know they were creating deformed babies and they just couldn't get their little grubby hands off their blood money? That's why you need to wait for testing for decades. What makes it real easy? Never fill a prescription for a patented medicine. If it's patented, it's simply not fit for human consumption. If your standards are lower than that, if you're not, up to human standards, then become a lab animal and let them just fill you with whatever they cooked up in their bathtub that morning. But if you hold yourself to human standards, I used to say 10 years of testing, but I think that makes it very easy. If it's patented, it's just not fit for human consumption. It's not ready. That makes it very easy to ask when your doctor tries to fill his pockets with kickbacks from these things. It's just not ready. And that's why there will never be a cold or flu vaccine that is fit for human consumption. Which is why what was done with this pandemic is just one of the saddest things I've ever seen in my life. And it seems to keep getting worse. But and among the reasons, as I say, that it would be good that we learned the lessons out of this. It would be good if that were possible. Because it really was a travesty on every level. I mean, just an absolute failure in mishandling the common cold, in miscategorizing the level of threat that it represented, certainly versus the harm that we've done, in collapsing our food supply, what's going on now in the Ukraine. Well, Putin was at the end of a pitchfork. Early on in 2020, they were having unrest issues because of food prices and availability. Putin was going to be at the end of a pitchfork if he didn't go out and find food for his people. Well, look at that right next door. 25% of the world's food supply in the Ukraine. And gee, they used to be just another Soviet state. So if they were still part of the Soviet Union, Russia would have been getting the majority of what Ukraine was producing, and they wouldn't be having these food availability issues that were caused by our pandemic response. And even in the speech that Putin gave before going into Ukraine, he essentially said, "How dare Ukraine act like they're no longer part of the Soviet Union? We'll show them." Well, here it is. The first battles of World War food. And now going on in Africa and in Darfur. Africa is becoming a quote-unquote hotbed of unrest. Well, that's just a colorful phrase for people who are no longer able to feed themselves by taking part in our little economic system game. Jobs don't cut it when food isn't available, and we've collapsed our food supply to the point where the amount of food that we need to feed our population is no longer available. And that's why it was so important for us to continue living normal lives and to keep the equilibrium of our civilization intact. And why what was done about the common cold is just an atrocity, really. Because it's leading us into a level of unrest that I'm not sure has any way of dissipating now. And certainly World War food, you don't need numbers anymore. And what are we on anyway right now? You know, Grenada was a world war. Every time they said coalition, that's a world war. So yeah, we're on like World War 17 or something, but it doesn't matter. You don't need numbers for World War food. Because yeah, there won't be anyone worrying about, no one who would understand numbers when it's over. And again, why, you know, wouldn't it be nice to learn these lessons so, hey, maybe we won't make it even worse. Particularly when someone gets a runny nose again, because Lord knows it's going to happen. And if we really think that anything done in the last 3 years was the right thing to do for cold and flu, yeah, it's only going to get much, much worse. So, yeah. So like I say, I have a lot of tangents, and I don't know. There's a lot of probably individual videos that would be a little more focused that could be put together out of this. But suffice it to say, as I say, cold and flu is the same thing. It's always been the same thing. It always will be the same thing. Covid-18, Covid-19, Covid-17, it's all the same. It's what you do with it that determines how many people die, and that's really on a lot of different levels. Both the individual infection level, as well as the societal and the civilizational level. Hopefully more of us can learn that lesson, and maybe we'll have a little bit of stability for a little bit longer. But thank you.